and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Lorena Navarro-Ruggiero, and thank you so much for showing up today. We want to give a big thank you not only to you folks in the audience, but also the folks that are the main sponsors of this event, which include the Aztec Model United Nations and President Rachel Weinshenker. Thank you guys very much. The student organization, they pretty much put this whole thing together. We also have the Fred J. Hansen Institute for World Peace and Professor of Peace Studies, Dr. Deepak Gupta. As you can see, we have many members of the political science department here on campus, so we'd like to thank them for participating. And then also ViewPoints, which is an SDSU podcast where we interview faculty experts on hot topics in the news, is doing the audio and video recording so that we'll make this available online in the future for some of the folks that maybe were not able to get in today. So, of course, we'd also like to thank our special guests, Provost Marlin and President Weber. Thank you so much for making it to this event. And for those of you interested in answering and asking questions, please note that we will be doing a Q&A section during the second half of the event. We pass out note cards and pencils at the door. If you are interested in asking a question, just write it down on the note card. We'll collect those during intermission. If you did not get a note card, you can also pick those up during intermission, and we'll collect those and go into the Q&A session. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Dr. Ron King, Chair of the Political Science Department. Thank you.
A wise former colleague of mine once said there should be a law. No, he said there should be a constitutional amendment that anybody who runs for president of the United States saying, elect me, I can do the job, I can solve the problems, should be constitutionally prevented from running for the job on the grounds of insanity. So we are now getting ready to inaugurate our 44th insane person as President of the United States. We live in an era of presidential government. The expectations for the presidency have risen enormously over time in foreign policy, domestic policy, economic policy, in articulating our national ideals and aspirations. No president runs for office saying, the problems are beyond us and they're very complex and our national powers don't reach that far. Certainly, no president runs for office saying, I just have one part of a complex system of checks and balances. Expectations have risen, and so have the powers of the office of the presidency. But no matter how high expectations have risen, how high the powers of the president have risen, expectations have risen faster. There's a systematic mismatch between an ever-widening gap between what we expect from the president and what any president possibly can deliver. Either the president will fail us, not articulating expectations high enough to satisfy ourselves, or the office will fail the president, since the powers of any president are insufficient to transform the world sufficiently without an extraordinarily supportive coalition or lots of luck. It's a formula that we've created for ourselves, which is inherent and structural. We expect miracles from our presidents, and miracles are very few. This forum is dedicated to foreign policy challenges awaiting incoming President Obama, and they are many, and they are severe, and they are immediate. The Hansen Institute for World Peace and the Political Science Department has a tradition of sponsoring public forums on critical issues with the goal of encouraging a more vibrant, more diverse, and more informed democratic conversation. The goal is not to present technical academic papers, but instead to promote civic enrichment, inviting students, the community at large, broadcasting the event via new media. Our goal is to link campus and the community in a manner that provides public understanding and improves the quality of public deliberation. It's exactly what we should expect from a major public urban university. There's great expertise at SDSU. Some of it is represented here on the panel today. We are going to do the panel roughly from east to west. Lei Guang will talk about China, Lata Varadarajan about India, Deepak Gupta about Afghanistan and Pakistan, Farid Abdul Noor about the Middle East, Adam Branch about Africa, Mikhail Alexeyev about Russia. They're all members of the Political Science Department, and we promise to leave ample time for questions and answers. And before I turn it over to Professor Lei, I want to express my personal regard and respect to my friend and colleague Deepak Gupta, who's responsible primarily for organizing this event.
Okay. You know, when Deepak gave me the title of this panel, he had it as Foreign Policy Challenges for the new Obama administration, or for the new administration. And I thought, what? I thought it's the U.S. that has changed. It should be foreign policy challenges for other countries when they have to deal with the U.S. If we apportion time on this panel according to the amount of time the candidates devoted to discussing each region of the world, I think China should just have 30 seconds. China didn't make any news this election season, in spite of the unprecedented media attention devoted to China because of the Olympics. So no strident rhetoric against Chinese government repression, no high decibel negative sound bites on the unfair trade practices. And even at the height of the Tibetan riot and the government crackdown, I think President-elect Obama called for negotiation between Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. So that was quite a change. And I think the Chinese leadership will also be pleased to know that in the Foreign Affairs article that Obama wrote in the summer, in August, that appeared in August, China appeared under the section with the title, Rebuilding Our Partnership. So that's a huge change when it comes to the US policy toward China. Now, there are several reasons why China has receded from the limelight in the presidential elections. And I think I'm going to mention three. And the first one is some of the long-standing flashpoints of tension have disappeared. Taiwan being one of the main ones. You know, Taiwan just recently elected a president who has adopted a very conciliatory approach toward China. In the case of North Korea, the 60-party talks, in which China played a very important role in bringing the parties together, have gone relatively well and reached a temporary, at least, closure on the important question of nuclear disarmament on the peninsula. And China has also voted with the US on a number of UN resolutions regarding, for example, Iran's nuclear program. And in spite of all the media attention about China's role in Darfur, I think China has also worked behind the scenes, try to pressure the Sudanese government to ease its oppression in that region. So I think that has somehow eased the tension between China and the US. And so we're not seeing China being singled out as one of the troublemakers. And I think a second point is that I think we also see from this lack of tension as a reflection of the fact that the China-US relations have moved beyond the bilateral engagement. In other words, the China-US relations are no longer about just China and the US. You know, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, we can probably name Taiwan, trade, bilateral trade, and human rights as the top three agenda items on the US-China relations. But now the relationship is much more about third areas. It's about China cooperating with the US on the Korean Peninsula, on Iran and Iraq, and on global economic growth, etc. So when China and the US are involved in so many things around the world, it's hard to paint a black and white picture of what China is or is not. Now, third reason, I think it has to do with presidential learning. I think the presidents don't learn things that in the past elections in 1980, 1992, and most recently in 2000, future presidents always called for a toughening of policies toward China, and only to come around and change their policies soon after they start their administration. They change to a more moderate and more pragmatic position. So one might say that probably by now there has been a broad sort of bipartisan consensus on China policy. So Obama and McCain might have talked with different accents, but they actually have adopted more or less a similar approach. And this approach sort of consists, to me, sort of the following points. One is that there is a general recognition of the rise of China's power, and that the Communist Party is here to stay. And the second point is that China is both a partner and a competitor. That China holds opportunities as well as challenges for the United States. And thirdly, that the right policy for the U.S. it follows is to engage China, is to recognize the differences, but to seek China's cooperation wherever it can. Now, having said all this, I think China still poses significant challenges to the new administration. I'll mention 4 today. I wrote out a pretty lengthy outline, but I think I'm going to shorten this to make this a 7-minute presentation. 2 having to do with economics, and 1 having to do with the expansion of China's global influence, and the last one having to do with the rise in internal ethnic tensions within China. Now, the first challenge, I think the biggest immediate challenge for the new administration is to manage the consequences of a sharp economic downturn in China. Now, this may have come as news to you, but having spent last year in China and coming back this summer, and I can tell you that the economic engine is grinding to a very slow motion on the other side of the Pacific. Now, the global economy has been running on these twin engines in the last 10 years, with China, with the U.S. on the consumer side, and with China on the production side. Now, we know that the consumer engine is sputtering, but to make matters worse, the Chinese production engine has been slowing and at quite significant rate, going back even before the current financial crisis. I mean, you see signs all over the place. Large factories, large numbers of factories in the coastal areas in southern China are laying off workers. The stock market has come down within the last year from 6,000 to under 2,000. I mean, compare that to the Dow Jones and you know, stock indexes in this country. Housing bubble starts to burst, and construction boom that led to the Olympics is over. And this is perhaps why the government is rolling out the largest economic stimulus package at this point, hoping $586 billion, about 15% of its GDP. Now, I don't think that kind of stimulus package is going to have a long-term impact. It's going to do something to raise the short-term growth rate, but any long-term impact in terms of increasing domestic consumption, I think is assigned to be watched. Now, all this means that we may have come to the end of an era, the era of China as the world's workshop and the world's factory, the last frontier of cheap manufacturing. And that means trouble for us. It means that export to the U.S. will decrease, but I don't know what a margin, but we sure will see the rise of the price of the goods that will come our way from China. So in other words, the American consumers are expecting to pay more for the imports, and the Chinese are not going to buy as much from the American manufacturers. And the U.S. export actually to the Chinese market has been increasing pretty dramatically in the last 3-4 years. Now, also in this general economic environment, we probably will see that China will be disinclined to take instructions from the new administration. Now, that's point number 1. The next 3, if we have 1 minute. The other one, second challenge is really to, in spite of the economic downturn, I think the trade deficit is going to continue, and that's because, although China is exporting less, but it's also going to buy less. And that, how do you deal with the backlash, political backlash associated with the large enduring trade deficit? That's a big problem. A third challenge, I think, has to do with how the new administration will view China's expanding activities around the globe. Should the U.S. be concerned about China buying up assets in this country? Think of the Unico debacle a couple of years ago, or by its investment decisions in Africa or Central Asia? Or is the primary challenge to the U.S. economic in nature, or is the challenge to the national security interests of the U.S. as China tries to warm up to some of the unsavory characters in world politics? Okay, my last point is that as we all have seen, that the pre-Olympic Tibetan riot and the unrest in Xinjiang, northwestern Muslim areas, suggest the rise in ethnic tensions in China. Now, ethnic minorities responding to a number of developments inside and outside of China. I don't expect these kind of tensions to go away, and I think they're going to increase. And how will the new administration handle these kind of largely internal ethnic conflicts will be something to watch for. So I think that's I probably exceeded my minutes. I'll be happy to answer questions later on.
All right. Notwithstanding the absence of China from the presidential debates, it should be evident to everyone that the United States finds itself in an extremely tense situation and faces potential conflicts pretty much in all the regions of the world. So given that, Indo-U.S. relations appear to be a pleasant change of pace. The United States is not currently involved in a conflict, military, diplomatic, direct or indirect, with India, and the possibility of a war in the near future seems to be pretty minimal, right? In fact, officials from both sides have agreed that this is perhaps the most amicable phase in Indo-U.S. relations pretty much since Indian independence in 1947. And they argue that the best illustration of this beautiful new friendship is the Indo-U.S. Civilian Nuclear Cooperation Treaty. So what I want to do in my brief presentation is to talk about this treaty, explain why it's seen as the symbol of a healthy bilateral relationship, and also explain why it's actually emblematic of a deep malaise in global politics in general and American foreign policy in particular. All right. Okay, so what exactly is the Indo-U.S. Nuclear Cooperation and Non-Proliferation Enhancement Treaty all about? Well, to put it simply, this treaty basically enables India to import civilian nuclear technology and fuel from the United States. What's the big deal about this? Well, this treaty, which actually came into effect last month, was the end result of a 3-year-long diplomatic blitzkrieg that participants, political elites from both Washington and New Delhi have been engaged in. And the whole purpose of this diplomatic blitzkrieg was to gut the framework of the non-proliferation regulation regime that the US itself had pushed for nearly 4 decades. What is this non-proliferation regime that I'm talking about? The basic non-proliferation regime is, of course, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that was signed in 1968. According to this treaty, there are 5 states that are recognized as nuclear weapon states. These are, of course, the permanent 5 in the Security Council: the United States, Great Britain, France, China, the Soviet Union, and now Russia. Right? And according to this treaty, it was only these 5 nuclear weapon states and other state signatories to the treaties that were allowed to engage in nuclear trade, in civilian nuclear trade. You had to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty in order to engage in civilian nuclear trade. India never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In fact, from the very beginning, the Indian state insisted that this is an unjust and illegitimate defense of the status quo. But it didn't just insist this in diplomatic meetings. In 1974, the Indian state actually carried out what it called a peaceful nuclear explosion, a nuclear test, to put it simply. Almost immediately, it faced a US-led global embargo on nuclear trade. No other country was allowed to trade with India with regard to nuclear supplies and fuel. In 1998, the Indian state carried out 2 further nuclear tests, thereby removing any ambiguity from the picture. It declared openly its nuclear capabilities. At this point, it faced further economic sanctions, and the global embargo was reaffirmed. However, things begin to change around 3-4 years ago. This is when Washington starts putting pressure on the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and the 45-country nuclear suppliers group. In part responding to the pressures put on it by Washington and New Delhi, both the IAEA and the nuclear suppliers group modified their charter recently. What did these modifications mean? Basically, they meant that India was recognized as a de facto nuclear weapons state, and the embargo against civilian nuclear trade was lifted. Almost immediately, on October 10, 2008, the United States and India signed the Indo-U.S. Civil Nuclear Trade Agreement. This was an agreement that was pushed through the US Congress. We didn't really hear much about it in the mainstream media just because this was the time when there were these frantic discussions about the $700 billion bailout. This was also passed by the US Senate by a vote of 86 to 13. Among those who voted in favor were Senators John McCain, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. So the bipartisanship that Professor Guang mentioned continues to pretty much every issue here. The Bush administration, along with the support of the Democratic and Republican leadership, insisted that this was a vitally important foreign policy initiative because A, it would create a global strategic partnership with India, check China's regional aspirations in Asia, and also open up India as a market, not just for nuclear technology, but also military technology. Indian state elites, of course, feel that belonging to the nuclear club is a surefire way to be counted as a great power, and they are more than happy to push through this agreement, which would allow for greater military cooperation between India and the United States. Indian business elites are happy because this will allow them to form alliances with US corporations and push for privatization of the energy sector. So here you have a treaty between the world's most powerful democracy and the world's biggest democracy. So this is a good thing, right? Well, not really. Because you see, there are 2 things I really want to just briefly mention. The first is that this particular agreement shows the hypocrisy of the non-proliferation regime that the United States is still trying to push through, especially in the context of Iran. Second, it's going to create a new kind of arms race in the South Asian region in specific and the Asian region in general, and I'll be happy to talk in detail about it during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I should start with an announcement that this particular program today is a precursor for a lecture series that Ron B., the director of the Charles Hosler Institute, and I put together in the spring semester. So there will be a semester-long program on this same topic. Secondly, I would like to respond to Ron King's suggestion that the President of the United States is not a very potent position. I think that it can be, provided he gets a suitably powerful vice president. On the 5th of November, we woke up to a wonderful new world, a strange new world. We don't know what to do with it. This is a world where people are running and waving American flags rather than trying to burn them. So it is a new world, and we do have a good bit of political capital. that we can possibly burn pretty quickly. The next point is that I'm supposed to talk about Pakistan and Afghanistan. But you know, it's like the same thing. The shin bone is tied to the thigh bone, and so on and so forth. I cannot talk about Pakistan and Afghanistan without talking a little bit about Iraq and Iran. I'll leave out India for the moment. You know, if you really look at the world we live in today, there is no country in the world that is more problematic or more dangerous, perhaps, to us, to the United States and its policies than Pakistan and Afghanistan. Pakistan right now is going through a convulsion, particularly a very strong economic crisis that has beset the country. There is hardly any trust in the government, and the military has withdrawn to its barracks, hopefully not to emerge anytime soon. You know, one thing very ironic about Pakistan, and it's really sad, that every change of government has been celebrated on the streets with dancing. That goes to show that over the last 60 years, Pakistani governments have never been able to develop the kind of civil society that they all aspire. There are some hopeful signs, though. There may be some political stabilization, and the military may literally not come out and may actually rein in the notorious ISI, the Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, their intelligence agency. Those are some of the hopeful signs, but at the same time, we see that currently the country is going through so much political turmoil with suicide bombing, you name it, ethnic conflict, religious-based conflict, the Taliban's, the Al-Qaeda. It is really one of the most unstable parts of the world. Then look at Afghanistan. We often conflate Afghanistan with Iraq. Afghanistan is not Iraq. Iraq, whatever you may think of Saddam Hussein, had a history of a stable government for a very long time with rule of law. However, Afghanistan, at least since 1980, is going through one war after another, and a whole generation has grown up without knowing what it means to have a civil society or have rule of law. Therefore, they have the allegiance for each person has gone down to the lowest common denominator, their clans or tribes. And in that situation, it is very difficult to develop a national identity. Also, as the economy has become completely dependent on the illicit drug trade, by some estimate, about 90% of the gross domestic product of Afghanistan comes from the cultivation of poppy seeds. In such a situation, legal and illegal, criminal and political, they merge together, and it becomes extraordinarily difficult to separate the two. One of the most difficult challenges for the next administration would be to over-militarize Afghanistan. The solution for Afghanistan is certainly not a military one and has to be a very long-term solution. And there are some danger signs that I believe Mr. Obama, President-elect Obama, has uttered that makes me very nervous about it. First of all, on October 7th, he said that killing Osama bin Laden is our biggest national security priority. It cannot be. Killing one person and finding him, it's worse than finding a needle in a haystack. It is almost impossible, and we should not pronounce it that way. The second thing is the violation of Pakistani sovereignty that he said that he would do very openly. And again, we need to work with Pakistan. Therefore, we have to make sure that we don't go down the same path. Today, President Bush regretted some of the more blustery statements that he made. For instance, he said he was sorry that he said dead or alive or bring them on. So we should not exercise in macho jingoism facing these very unstable places. And finally, shin bone to thigh bone to neck bone. We cannot solve any of these problems until we get our financial house in order, which is a very long order indeed. Thank you.
I'm supposed to talk about challenges in the Middle East. I'm supposed to have the easy part. Yeah. So I've tried to summarize it sort of with at least one main point that I can discuss in three contexts. The main point, I think, the main challenge that faces President-elect Obama at this point in the Middle East is to somehow find a means of convincing the populations of the Middle East, convincing the street, the people, regular people in the Middle East, that United States foreign policy is not hell-bent to disregard their interests entirely and their hopes and dreams, and not hell-bent to disregard their fears and sense of threat as well. I think that's the biggest challenge. And we can see this manifesting itself in the case of Iran, in Iraq, and in Israel-Palestine, about each of which I'll just say a couple of sentences. In the case of Iran, the new president will not be able to ignore the fact that the nuclear program in Iran is extremely popular. This is not the project of some crazy president. Any future Iranian government will have to contend with the fact that the population is very much behind this program. Why would the population be behind such a program? In terms of building nuclear weapons, the Iranian people feel very threatened by the United States in particular. The United States is fighting two wars, one to the east of Iran, one to the west of Iran. So Iran is sandwiched by American hostility. And there is this constant, very hostile rhetoric directed at Iran from Washington that cannot help but make the Iranian people very nervous. It is in that context that they place some priority on protecting themselves by acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, I think that that's not, the new president will not have to simply yield to that threat. His challenge is going to have to be to somehow find a means of credibly convincing the people of Iran that they are not under threat from the United States. Some credible means will have to be found. I don't know what it is, but that's the challenge that he would have to face. On top of that, the new president would have to accept, probably, the legitimate right of the Iranian people to have nuclear energy for peaceful means. And if that requires, as it does, some kind of an inspection regime, of course, that would have to be that would have to be put in place, etc. But it can't be put in place under the conditions that we have now and be credible. Under the conditions we have now, a nuclear energy program in Iran is bound to be turned towards nuclear weapons because of the sense of threat. So these two things are related to each other. Now, quickly to Iraq. I think the president-elect's policy vis-à-vis Iraq has been made relatively clear. He would like to withdraw the U.S. forces within 16 months, etc. Now, the challenge he's going to face is, again, the people, the populations. And not only the population of Iraq, but the population of the peoples of the Middle East. It will be about the conditions under which the United States withdraws from Iraq. Will the United States withdraw from Iraq under conditions that make it abundantly and unambiguously clear that it is not looking to have Iraq as a client state in the future, and that it is not looking to establish bases in Iraq from which it can then continue its operations, perhaps against the interests of the surrounding countries and the people of Iraq? Somehow, that's the new president would have to find a way of convincing unambiguously should this be an interest that he would like to further. In fact, he may not want to, but if he would like to withdraw completely from Iraq, the real challenge is going to be convincing the Iraqi people and the people of the Middle East that this withdrawal is complete and there are no hidden agendas behind it. Now, the third challenge involves the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here, the one minor challenge that the new president would face is reversing some of the damage done by the Bush administration, and he'll be happy to know they didn't do all that much damage. Yeah? The damage was in fact done before the Bush administration came to power. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process was in meltdown at when Clinton handed it over to Bush. So the only damage that the Bush administration managed to do is not in Israeli-Palestinian relations as such, but through its incessant interference in the internal politics of the Palestinians. The Bush administration's interference in the internal politics of the Palestinians has now yielded a situation in which there is a deep rift among Palestinians, a deep civil strife that has at some points reached something that could have become a civil war. And okay, we haven't had a whole-scale Palestinian civil war. What we have had instead now are two parallel Palestinian governments. The Bush administration's constant interference and the creation of incentives and disincentives within internal Palestinian politics has really yielded this result. So the least, and this will be a very easy challenge to meet, that the new administration can do is at least get out of internal Palestinian politics and stop micromanaging Palestinian politics from Washington. So that would be an easy one if he really wanted to do it. Now, the second one is harder. How to bring about a credible peace process between Israelis and Palestinians that does not suffer from the lack of credibility that the existing peace process suffers from at this point. As I mentioned earlier, the Clinton administration left a huge mess in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The last few months of the Clinton administration did more damage than the 8 years of the Bush years did. So the question becomes, how does a new president resist the pressures from within his own party and the foreign policy establishment within the Democratic Party to just drudge up the same old figures, the same old Clinton team, and see if they can't just make that same old Clinton thing work? The same old Clinton thing was a disaster, and the real challenge is going to be to try to find an alternative to it that is actually credible and that allows the United States to appear and in fact be an honest broker of a potential Israeli-Palestinian peace.
Thank you, Fareed. Is this on? Yeah. So I want to exercise a bit of poetic license. And instead of asking what challenges Africa will pose to the United States under Obama, I'm going to ask what challenges the United States under Obama might pose to Africa. Because I think asking the former is something like asking about the challenges that the mouse poses to the elephant. Now that said, it's true that sometimes elephants are afraid of mice. They think mice are acquiring and learning to use elephant guns, or that the mice are taking the gorilla's side in the war for king of the jungle. So sometimes the elephant, imagining itself threatened, will try to stomp on the mouse or impale it on a tusk, in response to which the mouse, understandably, begins to squeak in complaint. Now, hearing the mouse squeaking, the elephant suddenly forgets his previous fear and takes pity on the poor mouse. In an outpouring of sympathy, the elephant is gripped with the realization that the mouse is squeaking because it must be cold. And so the elephant, very thoughtfully, turns around and sits on the mouse to keep it warm. So I think this pretty well illustrates America's approach to Africa, especially in the immediate post-Cold War era. Africa was no longer a battlefield for proxy wars, and the U.S. wasn't quite sure what to make of the continent. Consequently, it took a number of different and often contradictory approaches. For example, it celebrated a so-called new generation of Africa leaders for their commitment to democracy and development, while also funding proxies that devastated and looted eastern Congo. it eagerly undertook a humanitarian intervention into Somalia, then prevented a UN intervention to Rwanda that might have stopped the killing in April 1994. But by the end of the 1990s, this haphazard approach to Africa began to coalesce around a new agenda, spurred on by the 1998 bombings of the US embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi. In this sense, the war on terror began in Africa several years before 9/11, most graphically apparent when the US bombed the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum in order to, according to President Clinton, combat international terrorism and the countries that sponsor it. Now, 9/11 made this tendency the rule. Suddenly, it was no longer Sudan that America saw through the prism of a war on Islamic terror, but almost all of East Africa, the Horn, and much of the Sahel. So, whereas during the post-Cold War era, the war on terror was only one strand among many, in the post-9/11 world, the war on terror became the rope into which all other strands of US policy towards Africa were woven, as democracy, development, humanitarian aid, and good governance were framed as functional to the war on terror. To quote the Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs in 2002, quote, "When I look at the map of Africa, I see many countries that are not failed states, but they don't necessarily have the government structures with which to deal with who is coming in and out of the country and what they are doing. So there is plenty of potential throughout the continent to serve as a haven, a base of operations, etc., for terrorists. I think you could look at a map, and out of the 48 sub-Saharan African countries, you could pick 40 that present that kind of an environment that they could go to." This attempt to tie all strands of US foreign policy into the war on terror, not surprisingly, led to a panoply of negative consequences. It allowed the language of good governance and development to be used as a justification for providing extensive military and political support to US allies in the war on terror. Allies that use that aid to engage in their own so-called wars on terror against domestic and foreign enemies. Examples of this are the increasingly militarized and authoritarian governments of Uganda and Ethiopia, key American allies. It also led to the politicization of supposedly neutral humanitarian aid, and it led to the support for a new round of proxy wars, such as Ethiopia's invasion and occupation of Somalia in 2006, in the name of democracy, no less, which has only led to further destabilization and poverty, exactly what the US claims to be working against in Africa. So now to the present. I think that Obama will usher in a phase that is not so much post-Bush as post-Iraq. Now, by this, I of course don't mean that the Iraq occupation is over, but rather I think that the period in which the invasion of Iraq was able to be justified is over. The dominant narrative now is that Iraq was a mistake that must be ended and atoned for. Now, this now dominant reformist critique of the invasion and occupation of Iraq can lead in two directions, and significantly, both have been associated with Obama at different times. The first is neatly captured in the slogan, "Out of Iraq and into Darfur." It calls for a supposedly morally justified American military intervention into Darfur as the redemption of benevolent US power from its destructive and counterproductive intervention into Iraq. As usual, Africa provides the raw material from which the West fashions its own salvation. First in Darfur, then who knows, maybe Zimbabwe. This idea, I think, was most associated with journalist Samantha Power, a close friend and advisor of Obama's, who was dumped from his team with a whole clique of moralistic interventionists when Obama won the nomination. Now, in their place came the standard bearers, led by Susan Rice, of the second mode that a post-Iraq US foreign policy towards Africa might take, one in which we are post-Iraq in the sense I noted, but we are still well within the war on terror. For this second group, now dominant, the disavowal of the war in Iraq provides the justification and opportunity for further entrenching the use of American military force in the name of American security, which they interpret as the war on terror stripped of its ideological zealotry and worst excesses, and framed instead as the sober, calculated application of American force. To quote the acceptance speech, "To those who would tear this world down, we will defeat you." The critique of the so-called war on folly, or war of folly in Iraq, ends up putting the so-called war of necessity in Afghanistan beyond question. Same as it does with the parameters of what comprises American security. That is, the critique of Iraq as an unnecessary war only entrenches the idea that there are necessary wars. That is, those that are framed as part of the necessary, now reformed, war on terror. And where beyond Afghanistan will the U.S. find these new fronts in this war of necessity? In Somalia, in Sudan, in Chad? Now, Susan Rice has explained that failed states, underdevelopment, civil war, and disease are all security threats to the United States and that all contribute to terrorism. So really, we haven't moved beyond 2002, I believe. America's foreign policy objectives in Africa are all framed as instrumental to U.S. security. But that's okay, the State Department tells us, because through an invisible hand, America's security interests in Africa align perfectly with Africa's own interests. Now, we've seen the consequences of this pretense already. At best, it leads to the U.S. imposing American understandings of African interests upon Africa. But mostly, it underlies the equally time-honored tradition of imposing upon Africa, in the name of Africans, policies that are only in America's interests, by force if necessary. And so I expect that U.S. foreign policy towards Africa in this post-Iraq phase will look much the same as it has since 9/11. Less fanaticism, but an equally uncompromising pursuit of American security in the face of perceived threats from Islam, from China, threats from African efforts to prevent the exploitation of oil and other natural resources by the West, and even the perceived threat of African attempts to construct national and regional institutions that might provide an alternative to the Western domination of the continent. Concretely, much of the American project will be centered around the attempt to impose America's newest military command upon Africa, called AFRICOM, for which Obama has expressed his unqualified support. True to form, American military presence in Africa is justified as being for the sake of Africans. The White House declared, quote, "AFRICOM will enhance our efforts to bring peace and security to the people of Africa and promote our common goals of development, health, education, democracy, and economic growth." But despite these reassurances from the Bush administration and the endorsements from Obama, thus far, no African country has been willing to host AFRICOM on their soil. So deep are their reservations about American military power and the uses to which it might be put. So the elephant continues to try to sit on the mouse, claiming all the while that it's for the mouse's own good, even once the elephant knows full well that the squeaking is not the mouse begging for warmth, but demanding to be left alone. Thank you.
Hello. I am going to formulate the challenge that Russia poses to the presidency of Barack Obama in one sentence. That's all you need to remember about Russia's challenge today. And the sentence is the agony of post-superpower, post-imperial, developmental dictatorship. And because you're mostly students, I want to make sure that you can rattle this off just like this, just the way I did, even if I bump into you 2 weeks from now at Starbucks. So, to make sure you remember it, I'm going to ask you to repeat after me, phrase by phrase, in chorus. If you say it weakly, you're going to do it again. So, let's do it. The agony of post-superpower, post-imperial, developmental dictatorship. Yes. Yeah. Now you're with me. Yes, yes, yes. All right. So now, let me explain what each challenge is. Post-superpower. Of course, 9/11 has been a huge tragedy. There are a lot of people who want to do harm to the United States, and there is the war on terror. However, Russia remains, to this day, the only country in the world that poses an existential threat to the United States. There is no other country or other actor in the world, we often forget it, and I think it's useful to remember it so that you don't panic too much about threats coming from China or India or Iraq or Pakistan. And don't commit thousands of lives and trillions of dollars to solving these problems. Whenever such a problem occurs, remember that Russia has thousands of nuclear warheads. Many of them, most of them, still targeting US cities. And it doesn't take long to launch an attack that can wipe out the entire United States. So that is important to remember. For that matter, Russia remains a huge challenge to any US administration. Recent news. Why the agony of this post-superpower? You may have heard, how many of you have heard a few days ago the news of the nuclear submarine accident? Most of you did. 20 people dying. Well, that nuclear submarine is a great story of that post-superpower agony. It was designed in the late 80s, still during the confrontation when each side had about 30,000 nuclear warheads targeting each other. It was started, the production was started in '91, but then the Soviet Union collapsed and it was postponed. When Putin came to power and decided to restore the greatness of Russia, decided to restore Russia as a great power, they started building the submarine again, and they finished it. It's an Akula class. It's one of the least detectable and the most lethal submarines in the world. One submarine like that has probably the capability of 185,359 Osama bin Ladens. So they built it. They built a new generation of missiles as well. And at the same time, during the Bush years, we retreated from the idea that we need treaties to contain these weapons. We withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which is absolutely quintessential treaty, because if any side has a ballistic missile defense, it means not that it can protect itself, but that to the other side it seems like it can become immune to the retaliatory strike. And therefore it can strike first anybody else with impunity. And therefore, no matter how much we say that our intentions are good, nobody in their right mind would believe us. Going back to Farid's issue, how do we make our intentions sincere? And that's why Russians don't buy it when we say, you know, we're building those missile defense systems in Poland and Czech Republic because we have this Iranian threat. And there's, what Iranian threat? Who in the right mind would build something against Iran? You know, this is of course directed against Russia. And there is nothing we can do, nothing we can say to assuage that fear just because of the structure of the situation. So the challenge is to get back to where we were during some of the darkest days of the Cold War in the negotiation process on nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction with Russia. So that's challenge number one. The post-imperial, the second one, the post-imperial challenge. You have, how many of you have seen the news of Russian tanks in Georgia this summer? Most of you have seen those news. The upshot of that story is that Russia has recognized the two enclaves within Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that declared independence and practically has incorporated them into Russia. Putin has said there is no administrative border between Russia and these republics. The budgets of these republics are being done in Moscow, and the military bases are being built, the naval bases are being built in Abkhazia probably as we speak. So Russia is not letting go of these places. Why is it important for Russia? For the first time since the Soviet collapse, the territory controlled from Moscow has increased. To the Russians, that's you know, one of those issues, what to do with that thing called Russia, which used to be the Russian Empire, which used to be the Soviet Union. And a lot of people saw the collapse of the Soviet Union not as liberation of these independent states, but as the shrinking of the Russian state. Suppose the United States collapsed and we only had the country called the United States around Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, you know, etc. And then here we will have the independent Republic of Surfing. So this, so the second challenge is very tough because it has two parts with this Russian empire. Number one is, how do we talk tough to Russia? How do we recognize and acknowledge the sovereignty and independence of these states, and yet at the same time live up to any kind of incentive or any kind of threat that we make? How do we say what we mean and mean what we say? And secondly, how we don't give false hopes to people like the Georgian President Saakashvili, whom we warned 4 times privately not to bait the bear, not to provoke the Russians. And yet, nevertheless, they ordered the first major strike on the enclave of South Ossetia. Finally, the developmental dictatorship, or sometimes called Ten Democracy, because there are 2 leaders in Russia, President Putin and, Freudian slip, President Medvedev and Prime Minister Putin. And how many of you heard the latest news that Medvedev talked to the Houses of Parliament and said we're going to extend the term of the presidency for 6 years? Again, so the idea is that it's a and this is a tricky part, because on the one hand, it's a clear autocratic system. There is no independent media. There is no independent source of political competition, because businesses are not allowed to donate money to candidates not approved by the Kremlin. There are no political parties to speak of. There's just one party of bureaucrats, the party of power called United Russia. And so, on the one hand, it seems like it's a strong power vertical. On the other hand, it's a brittle power vertical. And now with the financial crisis and the oil dropping down below $60 a barrel, which means the Russian oil price is even less, because about $7 less than the oil prices we have in the news. So that means that they may be facing potential instability. And what do dictatorships often do? They often make the situation around them less stable to increase their own stability. So the story when the American Humvees were seized by the Russian forces, when on Russian television they were saying during the Georgian conflict that, you know, we are beating up the United States and serves them bloody right, you know, this is one of the challenges. Now, I am optimistic. I think Barack Obama has the wherewithal to deal with it. First of all, he can restore the old Yeltsin practice, meeting world leaders like this, without ties. Yeltsin had this. I think Barack can do it. I can't see George doing this. But and not just to see that these people are good guys, you know, but who share our values. But the idea is to understand that there are different people with different interests, and the trick is to build multilateral institutions and act multilaterally on these common problems, and this is where we can take the lead. And I think we have the power, the authority, the enthusiasm, all these American flags being waved, and I hope we capitalize on that, and things will be better. Thank you very much.
We have a large number of questions. Some are very country-specific and some are general. And so I'll try to group the specific ones into more general themes. I've got cards laid out in piles here. The first one is sort of obvious. If you read the American media, you would think that the economic problems that are going on right now are American problems involving American bailouts with an American-centered solution. If I hear the panel right, they're certainly not. They're global problems involving substantial transformation in the international political economy. And so I'm wondering for the panel, for anyone who wants to begin, what is the consequence of the world economic depression, dislocation, on the foreign policy problems of this new era? Ray, start.
He teaches political economy.
Well, I don't know. I think the instinct on the part of the Chinese leadership is to turn inward, and you know, we have seen that China just roll out this stimulus package, and I think the Chinese government is not going to leave the exchange rate to the market forces, and it's going to intervene as rigorously as it has done in the past in the marketplace. So that's going to create problems with other countries. I think China realizes that this current global economic decline is going to do a lot of damage to the country, and is trying really hard, is really racing against time to implement a long range of a whole range of infrastructural projects. It is trying to make the best of the situations by doing some of the things that it has delayed and it thinks that needs to be done, including, for example, implementing basic social welfare programs so that you know, population in the country will start to consume more and not be worried about saving too much for their old age and health care. It's also using this opportunity to build a lot of roads and railways and hoping that you know, things will be turned up and maybe in the number of years. So I think China since 1978, 79 has really put economic growth on the top of its agenda, and its entire legitimacy in a way rests on these kind of impressive economic performance. So I think that China will turn inward more and will also try to become more control prone in order to quell all kinds of social unrest that will surely intensify as a result of the economic downturn. So that's my best estimate.
I'm going to keep it brief. I think this current downturn is actually going to throw into sharper relief the existing contradictions in the international system. I think in the case of the United States, it's going to reveal much more clearly the essential contradiction between the military powers of the United States, its military ambitions, and its economic ability. I think the sort of strange partnerships, global strategic partnerships that the United States has maintained with the rest of the world, the absence of China from the presidential debates, I think that's just going to be a thing of the past as the rest of the world, like India, China, and the countries that were doing so spectacularly well, so Russia, all of them start feeling the pinch of this. The temporary agreements and alliances that shape the international security realm are going to be stretched to their very limits and potentially break. I think this is going to set up much more conflicts in the near future.
Most conflicts happen when resources get tight. It's the human nature, we fight over scarce resources. So if this economic downturn becomes prolonged, there will be intra-state and interstate conflicts. There is a real possibility of that. There is no question about it. We are getting stretched to the limit. Our bailout plan, $750 billion, is not large enough. The IMF is being bombarded by requests from various countries, Pakistan, Argentina, Turkey, for their bailout money. And if the IMF runs out, because we're the largest supporter of the International Monetary Fund, the global stimulus package will be in jeopardy. So it's a huge problem.
Another set of questions seem to address the alleged inexperience of the Obama administration. One of the odd things about the American system of government is that every 8 years, sometimes every 4 years, we fire the 5,000 or 6,000 people who know how to do anything, replacing them with a bunch of people who have mostly never been in Washington before and don't know even where the bathrooms are in the White House. It would be as if you changed the chief executive officer of a corporation and fired anyone who had ever been in the top 20 stories of the office building. And so the question is, how inexperienced is this Obama administration? How much are they going to fumble? How much is the euphoria around the world representative of just believing that the Obama administration will not be capable enough of establishing a U.S. foreign policy? Are we going to have a long period of incompetent transition, or will the Obama administration hit the ground running, as it were? Yeah.
Actually, I should have said that since Russia spans 11 time zones, it's actually east of China. I could have started this. But actually, for this question, on the Russian side, since I know people, some people at least, who consulted Obama on Russia, I would say I'm actually quite positive, because there's a new strain of people coming in, and they're the kind of people, they have a lot of experience, academic experience, but also policy experience and interactions with the Russian colleagues, with the Russian officials, a lot of field research in the area. So I'm actually quite upbeat on the Russian side, and the kind of people who Obama will bring in, I'm sure.
In terms of Africa, I think what we see is what Fareed alluded to in terms of the Middle East, is that there's a resuscitation of people from the Clinton administration. I mentioned Susan Rice. Susan Rice was the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under Clinton, and she's slated to perhaps be National Security Advisor or even Secretary of State, I think, if there's a second Obama administration. There's a number of other people, less prominent people, who have been sort of brought back from the second Clinton administration. And so that's why I think that, we're going to see basically the same policies coming out of Clinton. There's no issue of inexperience. These people are very experienced under Clinton. But I don't know that their experience is so much of a positive thing in this case. I think we're going to see they're bringing back exactly the same policies in terms of Sudan and a very strong anti-Khartoum orientation, bringing back the same policies in terms of Somalia and the Ethiopian occupation there, the same policies in terms of Uganda and very tight relationship with President Museveni. So I think it's really a continuity of people from the Clinton administration now in the context of the so-called war on terror and this emphasis on American security in Africa.
Actually, a quick story on the Obama point man on Russia during the campaign, Mike McFaul of Stanford, whom I have known for many, many years. And, he also advised originally George Bush. He was invited before the first summit with Putin. And he gave George Bush the advice, don't overdo it, the personal side. Don't call Putin Vladimir. Guess what George Bush did? Right after the summit, he said, I met Vladimir. I looked in his eyes and I saw his soul. So I hope that Obama, they won't do that kind of thing.
The point that the press sometimes doesn't get is the President of the United States is not a person. The President of the United States is a team of a number of thousand people who work for something called POTUS, which is an office. President of the United States is a bureaucracy. And there are continuities of advisors. Very rarely is the president making policy, certainly never in a vacuum. There's another set of questions that have to do with terrorism. We all know Joe Biden said something about very quickly there will be some sort of terrorist attack that will put the Obama administration to a test. the Obama administration, Obama has said during his administration there will be at least some break from the politics of fear that has been such a dominant theme during the Bush administration. How much is terrorism a threat? That's one part of the question. And the second part is, how should the Obama administration respond to possibilities of terrorist attacks?
Well, since I am the expert I'm the terrorist. Maybe I should answer it. We have to put terrorism in a perspective, the threat of terrorism to our personal safety. Over the past 40 years, the data is pretty clear that about 340 people die from international terrorist attacks. By that, I mean when people from one country cross over into another and kill somebody. And that number, by the way, is slightly higher than the number of people who drown in this country in their own bathtub, which is about 320. So in terms of international terrorism, we have to keep the threat in perspective. Several times I get inquiries from people who would say, I'm going to Europe and I was wondering if I should because of the terrorism threat, So, you have to keep this in perspective. So the threat is really not to individual life, but it's probably to the perception of threat and the perception of the threat to the state itself. That's what makes it a very complex problem. And when the state reacts in a more than proportionate way, which the community considers to be unethical, then it only exacerbates the situation of terrorism. So when we face the threat of terrorism, which will never go away, whether it is from international terrorism or from domestic terrorists, such as what we saw in the Oklahoma City situation. Remember, it was a bombing carried out by somebody from the Christian Identity Group. Will the election of an African American as the head of the country, will it provoke more such attacks? Will it embolden these people? We don't know. We have to be prepared for it. And what I want to emphasize here in one sentence is that terrorism is a risk we cannot eliminate, but like many other threats, from pandemic to earthquake to global warming, we can try to manage it.
Another set of questions ask the panelists to talk about things that we haven't yet ventured on. Professor Gupta just touched on one, which is global warming. We haven't talked about international environmental issues. We haven't talked about international public health issues like AIDS. I'm just curious if anyone would want to venture into those areas a little bit beyond your specific fields of national expertise.
Ron, do these questions come as questions, or do they just come as statements? Because if you ask it as a question, maybe somebody would be...
The question is, what should we do about AIDS, or what should we do about global warming? So I'm giving you latitude to take them any way you want to.
Well,
What's going to
In
happen
terms
then?
of AIDS policy in Africa, I mean, I think one very obvious thing is that America should start being in support of the use of condoms again. I mean, that's pretty obvious. You know, a faith-based approach to AIDS prevention simply does not work. And we've seen in Uganda, you know, AIDS rates, Uganda, which successfully managed to get AIDS rates down, we've seen them start to rise again, thanks in large part to the Bush administration's, you know, Christian right influence and their tendency to put abstinence and be faithful first and forget entirely about condom use. So I think in terms of, you know, AIDS, that's one thing that I'm hoping is going to be, you know, lead to a more realistic policy on the part of the administration.
I mean, just on a broader level, though, I mean, these kinds of issues like, you know, climate change or global warming or public health issues need a lot of attention, a lot of resources. To take a bit of poetic license for the earlier question, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think those who are euphoric about the current administration need to worry about whether or not they're going to hit the ground running. They will. You may not like the direction in which they're going to run. That much I can tell you. But so I don't really think there's going to be a dramatic difference in the kind of resource allocation and the kind of attention and public policy that one needs to be seeing to make a difference in that at a broader level.
I want to follow up with a specific question. One of the points of tension over the last number of years has been an increasing tension between what East and West, or large countries and smaller countries, especially about development versus environmental issues. The Bush administration was particularly, what's the right word, resistant to any yielding of resources or advantages from the West in order to solve global inequalities or resolve issues of global differences in energy use per capita, East versus West. Do you think that the Obama administration will take a different line? Do you think there's a possibility the Obama administration might say that the more advanced countries will have to actually sacrifice something to establish a more balanced world political economy?
No.
That simply.
Yeah. No, to be honest, I think it's also countries like China and India, which really do not, you know, which have, at least in the past 10, 15 odd years, been at the forefront of making the argument that you cannot tell us to cut back on certain things because we are just getting to the stage that you are at. So with the kind of economic collapse that we are witnessing around the world, the last thing we are going to see is, you know, any change.
I'll disagree. I'll say there will be a difference. At least I will vouch to say, and I will put my 1,000 ruble bill before it devalues too much on the table for that, is that we will not read news reports that we used to read when the Bush administration came to power, how the Environmental Protection Agency killed research by scientists indicating the global warming trends, and really politicizing the science on the environment the way it was done, which is one of the big components. Because if you think of how the Montreal Protocol and then other multilateral efforts like that came up, they came up from scientists, international scientific communities that got together and exposed these problems to the public.
You know, I will see your 1,000 rubles and up it by at least $1 billion Zimbabwe dollars by saying that whether the actual policy changes significantly or not, one of the things that I absolutely expect from this administration is the change of face, the change of rhetoric, which is also extraordinarily important. It is not just what we say or do, but how we say. And in this case, for instance, we never heard from the current administration the C word, the conservation. You know, it would almost never come out of Bush's mouth. We never heard anything about sacrifice at times when times get tough. And we never talked about shared responsibility. So these are some of the things that I expect this administration to do, and this will have a very significant impact on how the United States is perceived. I'll give you one quick example. How little it takes sometimes to change perception of people. United States, which is the least popular, particularly in the countries where they support the rulers, this time in Pakistan, which is the most anti-American country by the Pew surveys, there, for one short period of time, U.S. became extraordinarily popular, which was right after the earthquake, when the United States sent in immediately a lot of support material, and suddenly George Bush was more popular than Osama bin Laden.
In terms of the environment, I want to bring up another C word, which is co-optation. I think that what we might see is exactly how effectively the environmental movement can be eviscerated and demobilized by its co-optation into the current administration around issues like clean coal, right? So that's what I'm, pessimistically looking for is exactly how the environmental movement is going to be co-opted by this administration, and how the fundamental transformations that it's calling for that do involve things like sacrifice and commitment, but sacrifice and commitment that are far in excess of what any president elected in this country could ever ask, not only of citizens, but of corporations and of its allies. So I fear that it's, co-optation might be the word for the next 4 years in terms of the environmental movement.
But let me just say a couple of words. I think clean coal was the only time that China was mentioned in the presidential debate, or maybe one of the few times then China was mentioned when President-elect Obama said, we should export clean coal to China technology. But going beyond this question of the environment, I think in terms of the policies toward developing countries, I think we are probably starting to see a shift from the so-called Washington consensus to probably a more, actually some people coined the word Beijing consensus that involves development aid to the poorer countries without these preconditions for economic restructuring and et cetera. Actually, a friend sent me 4-line jokes the other day, and it goes something like this. And that China, when it first became the People's Republic of China, had a slogan called 1949. The slogan is called "Only Socialism Can Save China." So by 1979, when China opened up and started its reform, the slogan became "Only Capitalism Can Save China." Then came 1989, it became "Only China Can Save Socialism." And now, back to 2009, the slogan becomes "Only China Can Save Capitalism." So that may, I think that's indicative of how important China has become on the world stage. But I think there will be a real push from countries like China for a somewhat new order in the international economy, and watch out for the weekend summit in Washington.
I think what you've heard is that we don't always agree with each other. None of us, I believe, are anywhere near as optimistic as the talk shows and the political commentators you're going to hear on happy television. Some of us are extremely pessimistic. Some of us are moderately pessimistic. And one or two of us, I think, will go a little bit beyond that. My wife, who's Romanian, is the most pessimistic. There's an expression in Romania that translated goes, "The change of kings is the light of fools." That's the most pessimistic position. I don't think any of us are quite that pessimistic, but certainly the kind of talk you hear all the time, this is a new era, we've turned the corner, it's a historical election, everything's going to be new, there's going to be fundamental transformation. I think our conclusion is a grain of salt.
But it is a fundamental transformation, and belief is self-fulfilling. So if you believe in it, it will happen.
Thank you all very much.
As well for helping organize this. Again, this is just a preview of the spring semester lecture series that Dr. Gupta and the Hostler Institute will be organizing. Again, this is an event also brought to you by the SDSU Aztec Model United Nations and ViewPoints, a podcast on faculty experts and hot topics in the news. Thank you again. Have a great evening.